Hello and welcome back to The Anecdotalist, episode 18, The Abduction of Travis Walton. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and with me as always, my co-host, Jason McKinney.
How's everybody doing today?
Tonight we're talking about the 1975 abduction of Travis Walton. It's an incredibly famous case, and it was just a matter of time until we got to it. So, Jason, are you ready?
I am. I've actually been having Grandma listen to some of our podcasts. We listened to Mary Celeste the other day, and she was really interested in it. So, if anything, we've got 80-some-year-old women that are into our podcast. So that's a good thing, right?
I love it. I love it. 7 loggers, exhausted from a day's work, travel down the wooded forest road. The dirt kicks up around their car, and the moon shines through the woods on their left. When suddenly, to their right, a glowing light shines through the trees. Coming around the bend, they notice something. A disc, floating in the sky. Before they come to a stop, driven by an unknown force, Travis Walton leaves the safety of the truck and travels into the woods before a bright blue light illuminates the woods around them. Walton is abducted.
So I have to say, if I was in a truck with a bunch of guys, I know I normally would say, yeah, I'm running for the hills in a situation that's kind of scary. In a situation like ghosts and such, yeah, I probably would. But I don't know. If I was in the truck with a bunch of guys and I just saw like a random light floating in the woods, I might get out of the truck and go investigate, you know?
Yeah, I don't know, man. We'll get into this a little bit further here. It's scarier than you think. If you've ever been in the woods in the pitch black, especially these guys, they've just been working all day out in the woods. They're like 30 miles from home. If you see a light in the woods, it might be a hunter with a campfire. It could be any number of things. I'm not trying to mess with it. But here's the deal, though. When he gets out of the car, he gets out because he sees the objects flying in the sky. They turn the corner, and there's this big UFO disc floating there, and he gets out and walks towards it. He didn't get out of his truck to go check out a light. He got out because he saw a disc and he was approaching it. And we'll get into that here in a second. That was just the cold open. We have some more details here if we want to jump into it.
Yeah, that's true. It sounds like in the cold opening, it was more of he was compelled. He felt the urge to go and do this.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Some of that. Was he compelled? Okay, so we have a classic UFO in the woods takes man situation. And so we're going to jump into what that looks like. What we're going to do tonight is cover the story step by step. There's an investigation, and we typically will cover that after the timeline if you've listened to our episodes in the past. But this one, there's not a whole lot of investigating, I guess, that goes into it. What we see here is kind of a mix in between. So there is some investigating, so it's just going to be wrapped up in the timeline itself. And then we're going to cover some theories, and then we'll jump into our own thoughts before we wrap up. So after winning a contract bid to thin out over 1,200 acres in the Apache National Forest in Arizona, Michael Rogers, he puts together this 7-man crew. And the bid was to clear the wooded area by August of 1975. But it was a huge job. And things were moving slower than they really liked. So they were granted an extension until November 10th. But in October, a Forestry Service inspector, he comes out to the site and he notes that he thinks there's no way they're going to get this finished by November 10th. And so the men are working tirelessly from dusk to dawn every single day. And Rogers himself said he didn't know if they were going to get it done, but they were going to work every single hour of every waking day to get it done by the deadline.
How long was the timeline? When was the start?
So, I'm not really sure, but I think it kicked off in the spring that year or the summer time frame. I know that they had to get it done by August, and somewhere I read that it was the beginning of the summer, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on that, though. I just know that they were nowhere near getting done by the deadline. They got an extension, and they weren't anywhere near being done by that extension either.
It sounds like Michael Rogers kind of put himself way over.
Yeah, I think what it was he just jumped on this bid and they accepted his bid and then he scrambled to get a crew together. I think that's really how it happened. And he gets this crew together and the job is just huge and they're just cutting and cutting and clearing as much as they possibly can, but they're nowhere near being done. And the thing is, I want you to keep that in mind as we talk through this episode because I think that might play a role in our theories later on. And that's why I put that here. I wanted to start off by saying these guys were in over their heads, clearing a ton of land that they weren't quite prepared to clear. And all of a sudden, one of their crew gets abducted. It's like this weird, is this an easy out? I don't really know, but think about it. So, November 5th, it starts as any other day. The men, they get up to the job site really early. They start clearing the area. They're cutting down trees and brush, basically working, sun up to sundown. And they have this 30-mile trek back home. So after they get done piling up brush and cutting down trees and stuff, they get back in their truck. There's 7 guys. It's an old pickup truck. Imagine, just think about an old pickup truck at this time. And the foreman, Rogers, he's driving. And it's not like a little asphalt road or like through the mountains or anything. They're driving on a dirt access road to their site. So they're in the middle of the woods on this dirt road, nothing around them. And almost right away, about a quarter of a mile into the 30-mile drive, they see this light through the trees. And at first they're thinking, okay, yeah, maybe it's the moon. But, if you've ever been in the woods when the moon is full, I'm not sure if you've ever done that. When I was a kid, we did a lot of camping. And if you're in the woods when the moon is really full, everything is lit up. The forest floor is lit up. It's like daytime out there sometimes. That's not what was happening here. They realized that, okay, the moon's on the other side of the truck. What is that light? And so they start speculating. They're like, okay, is it a hunter? Is he out here with his fire, his campfire? They're speculating all kinds of stuff. And they're just driving. And they turn the corner. And what they see is this giant circular disc craft floating like kind of right at the tree line. And it's in this big clearing. And they're all like, what the heck is this? And they kind of refer to it as like softly glowing is what they say. So the one guy basically says to him, it seemed like there was a big light inside the craft and it was like kind of like seeping out through the craft, seeping out through the windows, seeping out through the sides. And so it had this like soft glow, like as if a bright light was being concealed inside a disc and it was kind of seeping out.
Yeah, so this gives me like vibes of like a radiation source. I know you kind of like watch those movies where they have radiation contamination and like it's glowing, you know? It kind of gives me that vibe that maybe this aircraft might be running off some kind of radiation. Because, I mean, you have electricity, obviously. It kind of glows, but it's not like a battery. It seems like a radiation would be the more likable power source in this situation.
Yeah, I don't know. It's funny. I'm picturing as you were talking through that, I was picturing like Homer Simpson, like working at the power plant. They're and like the rods that they have that glow. And yeah, I don't know. It gives off this, and we've done a lot of these episodes, and I'm thinking back to I think it was Leveland, and they had that like oval shaped object that was like a neon glow, and that's the only other time I think of like a glow. But you're right, it does give off this weird vibe of that it's not a normal light. It's not like a fluorescent bulb like these guys are used to. It's not the sun. It's this soft glow that they're unfamiliar with, and you might liken it to like a radiation glow. But I don't know. It's a soft glow. But think of it that way. Yeah, you might be right in how it looks.
Yeah, it is kind of strange that it's kind of out in the middle of these woods, though.
Yeah, very odd place to be, and just in the middle of the woods where these 7 guys just happen upon it. And Rendlesham Forest, when we talked about that and the UFOs that appeared there, that was a little different because it was tied to the twin bases there. And this is just like in the middle of nowhere in this forest, and it's kind of a weird spot to be. And if you're going to fabricate a UFO story, why not fabricate one about a UFO in the middle of the woods that only you might see? But it's also, if you think about it the other way, maybe it's a fantastic spot for this UFO to be. Remember in Rendlesham Forest, we talked about they thought that maybe this craft was setting down to repair itself. Of course, you're going to set down somewhere that's off the beaten path, that's away from everybody. And they just happen to set down next to this logging crew, and they didn't expect someone to get out of the car and come approach it. So Travis Walton, he's sitting in the passenger seat when Rogers he starts to slow down, and before he stops, Walton opens the door and just steps out. The truck's not even stopped yet, and he just hops out. And the guys are like, "What is this guy doing?" And they're kind of frozen in disbelief that he's getting out of the truck. And he just walks into the woods towards it. And they're starting to panic a little bit as he gets close. It starts to rumble. And when Rogers talks about what he remembers, he says it feels like the steering wheel was just vibrating. To him, it was more of like a deep vibration and less of a noise. But to the crew, it was like this deep rumble that shook the ground and shook their truck.
It's very interesting to see how all these UFO encounters have very similar components as far as like the rumbling. Because I know in the Level End episode we did, it seemed like the ground shook and there was thunderous noise. They thought that it was like a storm that came in. I think that's really interesting that like all these UFO encounters have very very similar situations that happen. It gives more evidence that there could actually be something really happening.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. Yeah, the depth to the explanation is kind of interesting because yeah, when you think back on leveling that we did, that rumbling that they all described, this is what these guys were experiencing. And it's funny because you're right. It seems like these encounters all have undertones of like the same things. And the other thing to think about is was Walton compelled to approach the vehicle or approach the aircraft or whatever it is? Because if you think about like Rendlesham Forest, do you remember how he felt like he was compelled to walk up and touch the craft, and then all that stuff was downloaded into his brain? Kind of similar to that, where he felt compelled to get out of the truck and approach the craft. There's a lot of similarities here, and we covered, of course, Rendlesham Forest and Leveland, and those are earlier episodes for us. But as we go along and do more and more of these episodes, it's funny to see these trends or to see things that we covered previously come back up. And this is two pieces of that: the compelled to get out of the truck and go after the UFO, but then also that thunderous rumble that these guys are experiencing. So they all start screaming at him. They're trying to get him back in the truck. And all of a sudden, there's this bluish green flash. It lights up the forest, and there's like this big beam of blue light, and it hits him right in the chest, and he just goes flying like 15 feet. So Rogers is like, oh, shoot. And he just throws the truck and drive, and he just floors it. And they leave Walton. And so they're just flying through the woods, and maybe like a minute or so, maybe less. And Rogers, he like hits the brakes, and they're all freaking out, and they're yelling at him, what are you doing? We got to get out of here. And he's like, we can't leave Walton. He just got blown away by this beam of blue light, and he's laying on the forest floor, and we're driving away. So they all start talking for a second. They get out of the truck, and they're arguing about what to do. And they look up, and they see this bright streak of light just go across the sky. And they all start thinking, well, I guess maybe it left. So they hop back in the truck, and they go back. And they're like creeping. They're just going so slow through the woods in this truck, terrified. And they're thinking, maybe it's there, maybe it's gone. They're not really sure, but they're driving really slow. And they get back to where they left Walton, and he's gone. And they're looking everywhere for him. They're checking the bushes. They're walking all around. They're checking the ground. They can't find him. He's gone. There's nothing. There's no evidence of him ever even being there. So then there's like a 30-mile drive back to town still they have to take. So they all jump back in the truck. And at the end of this dirt road, when it comes to like when it hits the main drag, there is like a phone substation, and they call the sheriff. So Chuck Ellison, the Navajo County Sheriff Deputy, he shows up. His testimony was that they were hysterical, and his first reaction, he's like, these guys are drunk, or they're high, or there's something. Something is going on. They have to be drunk. But then he quickly rules that out. He said he steps kind of close to him, and he smells no alcohol. They're just all hysterical and freaking out. And he starts thinking, these guys killed this guy, and they're trying to come up with this wild story to cover it up. And so we haven't listed anyone's names up until this point, so it's probably the best place to do that, because he ends up calling the sheriff, and the sheriff comes and he questions each one of them separately about what happened. So let's talk about the crew really quickly. Of course, there's Travis Walton. He got abducted. There's Mike Rogers, the foreman. We talked about him. There's Steve Pierce, Kenny Peterson, John Goulet, Dwayne Smith, and Alan Dalis. So Rogers, Goulet, and Walton, they've known each other for a long time. And now remember, Rogers won the contract and he had to get the woods cleared by like November 10th. So it seemed like this crew was mainly made up of his friends. So Goulet brings his friends, Smith and Dalis, lastly, Peterson and Pierce. They kind of just a hodgepodge crew of friends to get this whole 1,200-acre job completed. We know Travis Walton, we know Mike Rogers, but they're all kind of tied together in some way. So anyway, the deputy, he starts questioning them, and they're, of course, talking about this giant spacecraft shooting their friend with a beam of light, and this guy is like, something's fishy going on. We have to call somebody. We have to get the superior out here. So that's when they call Sheriff Marlon Gillespie, and he comes out, and he's basically like this no-nonsense guy. They tell him the story, and he doesn't believe a word of the UFO thing. He's like, these guys did something, and they're covering their tracks. And so they're trying to come up with this crazy story to get away with it. So Gillespie, he's like, all right, we got to go out to the abduction location. I don't believe you guys are telling the truth. I need a few of you to come with me, and the rest of you go back to town. Don't leave town. So he takes Dalis, Peterson, and Rogers out to the abduction site.
I mean, can you blame this guy though? You got 6 guys that come in and say that, oh yeah, our buddy's been abducted, and it's in the middle of the night. Like, it just sound. I mean, it really does sound super fishy, especially when you do some more digging and find out that they're most likely not going to meet this deadline for this job. I mean, I'm sure this is a little town, so I'm sure they probably know about, them having to finish this job and how it's probably not going to get done.
Yeah, it's super fishy. And if you think about it that way, even with this story, like we know the ending here, we'll be talking about the ending here. But like if I was a sheriff and I went out to a job site really late at night and there were 6 guys, there's supposed to be 7. They're all like, we don't know what happened. This UFO took this guy. We don't know. I would be like, okay, something's fishy going on. These guys killed him, and now they're hysterical and they don't know what to do. They don't know how to cover their track. This guy has a lot of experience interacting with people that have done bad things. I imagine as the sheriff, and so he's probably like, these guys are hysterical. People are hysterical when they kill somebody by accident. They're trying to cover it up, and they're coming up with a story. I don't blame them either.
I mean, that's a good point too. Obviously, when you kill a guy, it's not something that's just normal thing that you can put off. I'm sure they had some really crazy emotions going on.
Yeah. And so they go to the abduction site and there's nothing. So remember, like in Rendlesham Forest, at least with that, we had some physical evidence. Tree branches at the top of the canopy, they were broken. The ground was still hot. It was like burned. The Geiger counter was pinging all over the place because of radiation. None of that happened here. There was just nothing. There was no evidence of anything. No person, no body, no ground disturbance, no tree damage, nothing. So the deputy and the sheriff, they're like, okay, there's nothing to see here. We can't do anything tonight. We don't have the equipment to like light up this area, and I don't see anything. So we're just going to go home and we'll come back tomorrow. And so that night, one of the deputies goes to Walton's parents' house and he tells his mom, he's like, hey, your son, he's missing. And this is like around 1:30 in the morning. And he tells her like the crew is saying he was abducted by aliens. And she just responds like, oh, okay, that's how it goes. Like she just was kind of understanding. It was weird. She basically just said like, that's how these things go. Like just kind of, she understood it. So then they thought the deputies were like, that's a really weird response. She then calls Walton's siblings and they did the same thing. Nobody's really shocked that he disappeared. They're like, oh yeah, when people get abducted, it's really weird. It's just kind of how things go. And the deputies are like, what the heck is going on? We have this crew that may have murdered this guy. We just told this guy's mom the story and she's just cool with it. It's a really weird situation.
Oh my gosh. Can you imagine like your mom gets told, hey, you've been abducted by aliens? Like someone tells your mom that you've been abducted by aliens and she's just like, oh yeah, that's normal. It's just Paul.
Yeah. 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 She would be freaking out. Well, that's the thing that's weird about this is the deputies, when they talked to his parents or they talked to her, I guess, they thought that he's missing. He's a missing person. and the only evidence they have was the crew saying that he was abducted. I think they were telling her that he was missing, and they gave a little bit more background, just like, hey, these guys are crazy. They said that he was abducted. And then she believed the abduction part. And they're like, okay, what's going on? Because they didn't believe it. No sane person would believe that.
Maybe they do believe in more crazier things, you know? Like it's perfectly normal for people to believe in some off the wall things. You know, my wife still believes in Bigfoot.
Hey, a lot of people believe in Bigfoot, Jason.
Oh, my bad. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend anybody out there that still believes in Bigfoot. I'm so sorry. I'm just saying, you know, there's some crazy theories out there and crazy beliefs, and this one's really off the wall, but I'll go with it.
Yeah, and we'll cover that a little bit later. That's the thing that's really interesting about this is that the Waltons, they're all big UFO alien. They're into all that stuff. That might shine some light on some stuff later, but they're really into it. And so that's something to think about when we talk through the theories. But for them to react this way is very odd. And I don't know what that means, what to take away from it. I come away with it thinking either they knew that they were going to stage this fake UFO thing, and so they acted odd, or they were so deep into like this UFO stuff, they're like, oh yeah, people get abducted. It is what it is. He'll come around. We'll find him eventually. Like that, it's just one or two things, and both are extremely weird. A couple days go by, and it's now November 7th. The sheriff office, they're treating it as a missing persons case. They think it's a murder, and they form a search party of 50 people, and they begin combing the woods. And they think, okay, we're gonna find a body. It's out here somewhere. And Walton's mom is like, "You're wasting your time searching for him in the woods. He's not going to be out there. He was abducted. He's on a UFO somewhere." And so Walton's brother Dwayne, he does a broadcast interview, and he basically explains that his family is super into UFOs and alien abductions. He says they all basically agree that if they were to ever encounter a UFO, they're going to approach it. And that's what they talked about. So to them, they weren't super surprised at all that one, there was a UFO, but two, that Travis would walk out and get taken by it because that's what they talked about doing. And so it's just a very odd thing that this family is super into UFOs. One shows up and Travis is like, we talked about this. I'm going to go out there and investigate. I will say, though, I did read somewhere that Walton's brother, he was digging through the brush piles. I don't know if it's a different brother or if it's the same one. I couldn't find the source again. When I first began doing this research, I read this somewhere and I couldn't find it again. But supposedly, when this crew was out here, they were leaving these big brush piles. And the idea was that once they cleared the woods and they put these piles together, another crew would come behind them and then burn all the piles. And so Walton's brother was dead set on the fact that, okay, Walton's been killed. They stuck him in one of these piles. He's going to get burned up. And he was just digging through all these piles. I don't know if it was the same brother or a different brother, but either way, this brother is talking to the media and it's super nonchalant. And it's really odd that he's basically saying the same thing that his mom is. He's not really gone. He's not missing. He's just been abducted. Don't freak out about it. It's fine. He'll be back when he comes back. And it's super weird. So the sheriff's office, they're still taking this really seriously. It's November 11th. They bring all 6 guys back to the station, the other 6 in the crew, and they do a polygraph test. And so on record, they basically say they had nothing to do with Walton's disappearance. And so 5 of them are shown to be telling the truth. But Dallas, his polygraph is inconclusive. And the thing with that is you might think, oh, maybe something happened here. My only thought here, though, is that Dallas, he was said to have like a lot of run-ins with the law, and he's had a lot of trouble in the past. And so him being in a police station, being interrogated, I imagine his lie detector test might just be all over the place. And they didn't say that he was lying or telling the truth, that it was just inconclusive. So I'm not like really shocked by that. But all in all, the police basically say nothing weird is happening here. All the guys are telling the truth. We don't have anything conclusive. They're free to go.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, the lie detector is like one of the components is detecting your heart rate. So when you start like thinking back to this scary situation, and I mean, it is a scary situation. Your friend's been abducted by an alien. I'm kind of surprised all of them didn't fail the polygraph test. And that would cause anybody's heart rate to go up when you're starting to try to recall going back into those woods and thinking about when your friend just got abducted.
Yeah, you'd think panic would set in and it would cause the polygraph to go all over the place. It did, at least for Dayless, and made it inconclusive. But it is, yeah, you're right. It is really interesting. You'd think them thinking back on this situation would cause them to freak out. At that point, it had been 6 days, and they're like, he's gone. This is what we saw. I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, Dayless, his was inconclusive. And so at this point, there's a ton of confusion. And this story is starting to take like national headlines. And it's basically this missing persons case. And it's really extremely cold. But across the nation, they're starting to pick the story up that, hey, this guy in Arizona got abducted. And so all over the US, they're seeing these headlines of a possible UFO abduction. So now it's November 12th. And around midnight, Walton's brother Grant, he gets a phone call. He picks it up, and it's Walton. He was calling from a payphone 30 miles southwest of where he was abducted. And so Grant, he's like, I'll pick you up, don't worry. He goes and grabs Dwayne Smith, who was from the logging crew, and heads to where Walton was calling from. So they get there, and Walton is like super skinny. He's visibly thinner. He's lost weight over the course of that week. He has a week's worth of facial hair on his face, and he has this weird lesion on his inner arm. And so Walton, he's confused, and he's thinking it's the same night still. And they get him home, and he immediately is approached by the sheriff's office. They bring him in, and they give him a polygraph, and he just fails it. So you might be thinking, okay, well, there you go. He made it all up. He failed this polygraph. The problem is he has taken several since then, and he passed all of those. And so it's kind of easy to point out to the fact that, yeah, of course you're going to fail a lie detector test. He just spent 5 days abducted in a UFO. And Jason, you were just saying this. You're going to be all out of whack in the immediate aftermath of just like waking up on the side of the road after being abducted. Of course, your heart rate's going to be all over the place. You're not going to be able to answer things right away.
But you also have to think that this guy is probably not very nutritionally sound. I mean, it sounds like he might be a little dehydrated. If he's dehydrated at all, it could be that his heart rate's up because of that. There's so many reasons that, he could have failed this lie detector test the day after they find the guy, just after being abducted.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's not admissible in the court, because you can't really trust it all that well. If he's physically different, of course he's going to fail. So Walton goes on to explain what happened to him after the beam of light hits him and the guys leave. And so let's talk about what Walton experienced like on the craft. So his testimony is that after being hit by the beam of light, he wakes up and he's laying on what he thought was a hospital bed. He looks around, realizes not only is he not in a human hospital, he's also surrounded by non-human beings. He describes them as hairless, white human-like creatures in coveralls, which he, of course, reacts to. Remember, he thought it was still the same day when he was picked up. He was only conscious for a couple hours in that entire 5-day period. And so he also speculated that the mark on his arm was from some sort of like alien IV that not only kept him unconscious, but also fed him during that 5-day period. But he did lose about 10 pounds or so during that entire ordeal. So naturally, how these things go when UFOs abduct people, they later go and get hypnotized to figure out what happened. So that's what he does. He gets hypnotized by a guy named Lester Stewart. So the regression hypnosis starts, and Walton recalls waking up in the craft, kind of like burning up. He's really hot. He's not sure why. He thinks he's in a hospital. He's kind of confused. And then he realizes, hey, I'm still wearing my coat. If I'm in a hospital, why did they not take my coat off? I'm laying on the table right now. He looks down and he sees this device that's on his chest. And it's connected to his armpits and like his stomach. He also goes on to talk about how weird the room was shaped. That not only did it not look human, but it wasn't like a normal square room. And like it didn't make sense to him. It had like a weird shape to it. And so the funniest thing is that he talks about the aliens. He describes them like we talked about above, but like they're wearing proper PPE. Like they're in surgical masks. They're wearing caps. They're hairless, but they have caps on, which I thought was hilarious to me. Like, why wear a cap if you don't have hair to worry about? And they have these like wide, dark eyes. And so he just panics and he ends up backhanding one of these aliens. When he hits it, he said it feels like this weird, spongy, like non-human feeling to it. And it like goes flying back and knocks over another alien. And they just fall onto the floor.
Well, good to know that we can easily beat up these aliens.
Yeah, physically we can punch him if we want to. But I mean, at the same time, he did get abducted and he spent 5 days attached to something. And so he jumps off the table, but he's like kind of too tired to like, hold himself up, and he just falls to the ground. He gets up and he grabs what he describes as like a glass tube. It's on this table of instruments, like surgical instruments. And he grabs it. It's like the only thing he can really wield. And he tries to break it on the surgical table. He like smacks it against the table because he's like, I'm going to break this thing. I want to stab these guys. But it doesn't break. So he just starts like swinging it wildly all around. And he backs into a corner. And the three aliens, they just kind of stand there watching him. He's like in this corner, waving this glass tube around. And instead of like attacking him, they don't say anything. They don't talk. They don't make noises. They just turn around and they leave. And he's like, all right, I got to get out of here. So he starts looking through the rest of the room, looking for a weapon. And he like quickly realizes there's not really anything in that room that's going to work. And so he just drops the glass tube and he runs out. And so he's in the hallway and he's looking for an escape. So he starts running down the hall. And at the end of the hallway, he sees a doorway and he cautiously kind of looks into it. And he says he sees this 10-foot high dome ceiling with a chair in the middle of the room. And so reading this, I was thinking, okay, this kind of reminds me of like the bridge from Star Trek or something. Like it's a control room, or like the bridge where the captain sits in a chair in the middle of the room. And he says it has like a lever on the one side and a green viewing screen on the other, and with like a control panel with buttons and stuff. During this, he walks up to the chair and the room darkens. And he basically describes it as the ceiling is dark and dotted with what looks like stars in the night sky. So he just starts pushing buttons on the control panel and nothing happens. So he sits down in the chair and he starts pulling on this lever. And when he does, the stars or little points of light above him, they all start to move really fast. And he kind of freaks out. And so he puts the lever back the way that it was, and all the lights move back into place like their original position. And he's thinking, okay, maybe he's starting to steer the ship. So I'm just not going to touch anything. I'm not going to try to like play with anything. I'm steering a ship right now. I might crash.
Some alien is like sitting in the control room watching all this happen. And he's like, this idiot just sent us like light years into space.
Yeah. He just took us around Mars. And so he turns around during all this, and there's a human standing there. And he's wearing this like spacesuit. And it's like a blue jumpsuit with a helmet. And so Walton's like, oh, great, there's another human here. And he asks him, he's like, what's going on? And the guy, without saying anything, just grabs him and leads him out of the control room and down the hall. And so Walton's like, all right, we're getting out of here. And they descend into another room. And this room, it ends up being some kind of hangar because he turns around and he sees the spaceship, the same spaceship we saw in the forest, is sitting in this big room. And he's like, oh, we're in this spaceship. We just got out of it. And so the human leads him into another room. And there's 3 other humans there. And they're all standing around. They're all wearing spacesuits. And he starts asking them all these questions. And they just don't say anything. They don't respond. And they just move him to a table. And he sits down. And he starts realizing these guys look kind of off. Like they're way too attractive. They all have perfect features. And he starts realizing that even though they have human features, they don't really have human-like expressions. And they start coming off to him as like not real. Like they're humans, but they're not humans. And so again, he starts to panic. And he's like, I gotta get out of here. He's on this table and they're holding him down. And one of them produces this little mask. And he kind of describes it as this like oxygen mask, but it's not hooked up to anything. It has this like little black ball on it. And they put it over his face. And everything around him starts to like fade slowly away and goes dark. And then he just wakes up on the street. He looks up and he sees this disc above him, and it's floating above him, kind of similar to what he saw in the woods. And then it shoots off into the sky. And so he's laying on the side of the road. He gets up and he just starts running. He's running down the road and he finally finds a payphone. And at that point, when he gets to the payphone, he calls his sister's house. And his brother-in-law, Grant, he picks up and he comes and picks him up. That was Walton's point of view of what happened.
Wow, I can definitely say that I would never want to be abducted by aliens. I think I would just have a panic attack and die. Cardiac arrest on the spot from so much panic. At the same time, the way he described it, what it felt like to punch an alien sounds kind of cool. And especially if like you punch one and you punch it hard enough that it'll knock it far enough to hit another alien, just sounds kind of cool in itself. So, I mean, that part might be kind of cool, but I don't know. The whole situation just sounds kind of, it does not sound like a good time.
No, it doesn't. Well, imagine that for a second. You wake up in a room and you're in a room you've never seen before, surrounded by beings you've never seen before. And then you finally feel like you're safe and you realize the humans that are standing around you are like fake humans. That's just like an absurd, crazy thing to happen.
Yeah.
It's funny because when I was thinking about this, as I was researching this, those three aliens, they leave and they probably decide, okay, he's panicking. Let's produce what looks like humans to him to make him more calm. And they come up with these other human-like people to do whatever they were doing to him to get him to calm down so they can put him back to sleep. And so that is a very freaky thing. If this is all true, that is a terrifying thing to really consider, that there are aliens that are capable of looking like humans to us. And how many people have you seen on the street that you think, wow, that person looks way too good to be a real human being?
I mean, every day I look in the mirror, I think of that.
You're like, I just cannot be real.
I must have been abducted at some point in time. But I am like super curious though. Did they find any other marks on him other than the mark underneath his armpit? Because he said it was on his stomach.
No, just so you know what's really weird is that like medical staff came in and looked over him, but they didn't let them record anything or write anything down. But they did investigate. But I think it was just that one lesion on his inner arm and nothing else.
Interesting. Was it government that wouldn't let them record anything?
No, it was them telling this ufologist that came in and brought their own doctor. They told them they can't record anything, which I think is kind of weird that they didn't let them like record what they were doing.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
Something's getting covered up here.
Yeah, it's very weird. But usually when you talk about cover-ups, you talk about like government cover-ups. This was more them covering their own tracks, which I find kind of odd. So that's the story. That's the timeline. And before we jump into like our theories here, I want to take a second and talk about a couple things really quickly. So Walton, he's made some money from this story. He claims he wants this all to go away, but he's done a ton of interviews. And even fairly recently, he was on the Joe Rogan show. So the National Enquirer, they pay him like $5,000 for the rights to this story, like really early on. And so then Walton does that. He lets them do this story. And then he writes a book. And so that book becomes a movie. And then they re-release the book when the movie comes out in 1993. So there's a bit of money and fame to be had here. And Walton fully embraces that part of it. The interviews, the book, the re-release of the book, the movie. He has basically made money from this. I never read anywhere that they finished clearing the woods. I don't know if that ever happened. I was like looking for that. I don't think they ever finished the job they started, but they did launch a career from this abduction, which I find kind of odd.
So I know this is kind of random, but do you know if this was in Project Blue Book at all?
So Project Blue Book ended in 1969. So this was 6 years later. And so whatever government entity that handled UFOs that we have now, that's probably under wraps or secret or whatever it is. I'm sure that has the story. But yeah, Project Blue Book was wrapped up in 1969.
Oh, okay. Is this guy still alive today?
They're all still alive and they all talk about this story. And there's even like a Discovery Channel episode, and I'll link a part of that in the show notes that I watched where they interviewed these guys.
Oh wow, that's so interesting. I mean, these guys got to be pretty old though. 1975 is when it happened. So I mean, they got to be what? In their 70s, 80s, right?
Well, not that old because they were pretty young at the time. So they're like our parents' ages, 50s, 60s, 60s, 70s maybe, somewhere around there.
Oh wow.
Yeah, not too old. So our first theory is this was all just a big hoax. And so remember, we talked about at the beginning of the show how they were running out of time to get this job done. They needed more time, they got the extension, and then they still weren't going to get it done. So was this like some kind of stall tactic? I didn't really read anywhere that it got finished, right? And so what happened to that contract? Did they just get out of it because one of the guys went missing? It's also super weird to me that the Waltons family they reacted the way they did. It was normal that he disappeared. Their family was just kind of like, "Oh yeah, aliens abducted him," and they were just cool with it. They also had recently watched a movie about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, so they were kind of we covered that in episode 8 and 9, but they kind of just were like, "Oh yeah, this is how things go." It's odd to me that they were all just comfortable with this whole thing. And did Walton think I can fake being abducted? We could put this hoax together and get out of this contract or get an extension or whatever they needed to do. And so then lastly, in March of 2021, really recently, Mike Rogers, the foreman, he distanced himself from all this and he claimed that the whole thing was a hoax. And so that he basically said this was all staged. However, really quickly afterwards, he retracted that statement. So supposedly Rogers and Walton, they had this falling out and Rogers claimed the whole thing was fake. But once they reconciled, he withdrew the statement. So either A, he was like pissed at Walton for some reason and was just trying to get back at him because Walton's working on like he's still, making money from this, or B, this was actually a hoax, and Rogers was like, "All right, I'm done with this," and he tried to blow the whistle. But at the same time, he did withdraw his statement. So
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is kind of suspicious that the whole contract was coming to an end. They couldn't make the time, so they, sitting out in the woods, and they're like, "Hey, maybe one of us goes missing. We know the aliens is a popular thing around here. We can just say, hey." But then again, if they were trying that hard to like pass it off as UFOs, why not, make like some tracks like a ship had landed?
yeah, do something.
Yeah, why not cut some trees down or the tops of the trees down, make it look like a UFO ship had come in, and then like put more to the story other than just, oh yeah, he was taken.
Yeah, that is interesting because they would be familiar with like all the actual evidence. They didn't put much into it if this was like a true hoax.
I mean, they could have easily spread some like blood around, like some fake blood of an animal or something, just to be like, oh yeah, he was.
Or just like stamped around. They could have just like walked around in a circle and stamped out the ground to make it look like there was a circle on the ground. Anything to make it look like there was some kind of physical evidence, but there was none.
If this is all a hoax, they didn't try very hard to do it. They got away. I think they got off pretty easy if this is all a hoax.
Yeah. So the next theory is could this be aliens? So all of the UFO encounters we've covered up to this point, the big differences in what took place, I want to point out there is zero physical evidence on the site. And we just, talked about this a second ago, but like there's no evidence. There's no burn marks, there's no broken branches, nothing. But the question becomes like how intently were they actually looking for that stuff? So they went immediately that night and they couldn't really see anything because it was dark out. They didn't take soil samples and they thought the guys had murdered their crewmate. So they weren't really looking at physical evidence. And the other stories we've covered, they've actually went back to the site, taken samples of the ground, the soil. They've looked and they found things. They like inspected the trees. They were looking for UFO evidence. In this case, they were just looking for a body. They weren't really looking for was the ground burnt? Was there radiation here? Or treetops or pieces of branches way high in the trees broken? They weren't looking for any of that evidence. And the one thing that I did come up that I found was that supposedly, like 15 years after all this happened, they visited this site and the vegetation around this area was like super thick and overgrown. And the claim is that the radiation from the craft set off some type of like overgrowth here. And then the other thing is that they also took some core samples of the trees that showed like abnormal growth, and the soil contained a chemical change that made it different than the surrounding soil. But take all that with a grain of salt because I don't really know how definitive all that was. It sounds like it came from the guys came back later and they brought somebody with them, and supposedly all this happened. There's not a whole lot of hard evidence on that specifically, but it is interesting that they're claiming that that ground where this UFO was, all the greenery is like overgrown and the soil is different than the surrounding area, supposedly. So there's your physical evidence, I guess.
Yeah, it definitely has more hoax vibes to it than it does like reality, for sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's, when you're talking about aliens, though, I feel like, I mean, almost anything is possible,
True. True.
The main thing why I would think it would be a hoax is because the family. If the family came across as like, yeah, this is nothing, they kind of are nonchalant about it, that just seems really suspicious to me. It could have easily been that this guy was just out in the woods and he just camped for 5 days and was like, yeah, I'll camp out here for 5 days and we'll say that I was abducted and then come back. He could have got a mark on his arm. Once again, though, if this was all a hoax, I feel like they definitely didn't try very hard. And you also have these polygraph tests that, they did.
That is very, very weird that everyone pretty much passed the polygraphs. Okay. So our next theory is kind of a bit of an extension from when we covered the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. And this is like some type of human government. So remember, Walton interacts with what appears to be humans on the craft. But of course, the key difference is that the humans from like the Hills experience, those actually talk to them. They seem like official people in government. These humans seem more alien to Walton. So I don't know how much this is, but I was thinking through this like if you did see humans on a craft in a hangar somewhere, maybe this is some kind of weird government thing and he just like stumbled upon it. And these humans were trying to knock him out and they're like, okay, we're just going to like wipe his memory. No one's going to know about it. And he ends up getting hypnotized to pull this stuff out. So could it have been like a government thing?
Or, like, these guys are from the future, and you said that these trees all had evidence of overgrowth. Maybe it's people from the future trying to come back and help the Earth. They're like, yo, the Earth's going to die quick, so we need to make it grow faster and stronger.
Maybe come back and do some stuff. Well, actually, that's my final theory is that it's some type of time travel situation. Kind of like in Rendlesham Forest where they thought that the crew had come back in time and got stuck and had to leave and they weren't intending on being interacted with somebody because remember Walton, he approaches the craft and they talk about it as like a level of him being compelled to do that, but they also talk as if like the craft was caught off guard. So Walton thinks that he approached this craft, they didn't expect a human showing up and approaching them, and they zap him and they're like, oh shoot, we knocked this guy out, and they have to bring him back on the ship and repair him before they send him on his way. Maybe there's that element to it, the time travel thing. That is something we talked about in Rendlesham Forest, episodes 3 and 4. But like, I don't know, maybe that's part of it. That they are from the future. They came back, they broke down, they parked in this forest. They thought that nobody would be there, and then all of a sudden, this guy walks out of a truck and approaches them. They shoot him, and they have to heal him.
Yeah, I mean that does kind of make sense. I kind of like the idea here that they had their own hangar. Like it kind of scares me in a way that there might be like some random hangar out in the middle of the woods somewhere that's got alien crafts sitting in it with aliens like experimenting on people out in the middle of the woods somewhere.
Yeah, that's odd. I didn't really think of it that way, but that's a good thought because I was thinking of it as like again through the lens of Star Trek, as always, that they have their own like shuttlecraft that go out and they come back and land in like a mothership somewhere. That was more my thought. But that's also kind of creepy to think that on Earth somewhere there's a big hangar and they have crafts coming and going from these places. But I was thinking more of like a shuttlecraft of some kind going out and then capturing this guy, bringing him back to like a bigger ship somewhere.
It's kind of interesting. In this situation, the alien, they didn't talk to him at all. So you had like Rendlesham Forest where there was glyphs on the aircraft that they could see, that he was able to see, and they glowed when he came up to it. You had Betty and Barney, who was abducted, and the aliens talked to her. Like there's always some kind of communication that came across, and in this situation, there was none.
Yeah, that is odd to me. That is weird.
So yeah, it definitely comes across more of like an accident situation.
So we're at that part of the show where we're going to start speculating as if we haven't done that already enough. But let's talk about like what our thoughts are. Like Jason, what do you think happened here?
So I honestly kind of am leaning a lot towards this is just a hoax. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's kind of odd that this contract was ending and this created a situation in which they were able to go and say, well, now I can't finish it. And there's this huge event that happened that got known nationally, and it was able to hopefully help them either get out of the contract or just completely go sidetrack on the contract and be like, well, I need a lot more time to do this, or even get more money out of it, saying, well, I'm not going to endanger my working crew and getting abducted again unless you pay us more money.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'm leaning towards like a hoax here. There's just too many variables that push me in that direction. They were getting close on contract. They weren't going to finish in time. They made so much money off this, and they were so invested in all the interviews and all the things, the books and the movies. And then finally, the last thing, I just think it's odd that whether it was a falling out or whatever it is, the fact that Mike Rogers in writing put that this was a hoax, I think that just like is the final nail in the coffin for me. That yeah, this thing didn't really happen, but it is a famous UFO encounter, and I wanted to cover it. But yeah, to me, the way I feel about this is that it was some kind of hoax.
It also kind of makes you wonder. There's only two things that kind of put me off about this. Well, three things that kind of put me off about this situation. One, if it was a hoax, why was it done so poorly? Like, why wasn't there like, like we said, stomping the ground to make it look like an aircraft had landed? Why was he gone for 5 days? Why not completely disappear? That would have made it really bad. And then the polygraph tests, it's kind of weird that those all came up, one inconclusive and the other all not lying. And then three, why did we have to get a hypnotist involved to get that story out of him? Why didn't he just say it right off the bat without being hypnotized?
That is super weird to think that they passed the polygraph. They did a really bad job of making it seem like an actual encounter. And yeah, he was hypnotized, and this story came out of that. I don't know. You're right. You're right. There is some weird things to it. There's never a clear cut, this is what happened. And if you're coming to our podcast to hopefully hear, like, here's what happened, I don't know what to tell you because we both feel like it's a hoax. But at the same time, there's enough things here that, I don't know, maybe this did happen. And maybe we're like, these guys hoaxed it. And poor Walton was actually abducted. And it's just a different story than what we're used to.
I mean, if he was abducted, he sounds like he had a pretty good time. I mean, he got to punch an alien, he got to see some really cool stars, and then he got to go back to sleep.
Yeah, I flew a spacecraft for like half a second. Okay, well, thank you all again for tuning in to another episode of The Anecdotalist. Remember to subscribe and share with your friends. And as a reminder, our next episode will be the last episode before we get into our October Spooktacular. So expect one more show with a 2-week gap. 2 weeks after that, we'll hit October, and that will be one episode per week. I hope we can do it. I think we can. I got some episodes written up already. And so it's going to be a blast through the month of October. We're going to do one episode a week. So we'll see you then.